So with Strixhaven being out for a few weeks, if not almost a month now, I've come across in my time playing, in standard, and kind of come across a few decks that I actually found very interesting. That I kind of did my best to kind of research what the decks kind of consisted of, but then I also did my best to kind of put together these decks that I'm going to be going over in today's video. Hey everyone, Scar TV coming back at you with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we diving into some decks, maybe some on the budget side, maybe some a little bit more on the little bit expensive side, a little bit of mixture of both, but all the decks are, I find, to be fairly interesting and definitely unique in their own way if you're looking to play something maybe a little bit different than maybe what the meta is. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It lets me know that you guys like the style of content. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's talk about it. Now, the one thing I want to do before I kind of dive into the decks, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping on the channel real quick. If you want to skip ahead, go ahead. It's fine. This will only take like 2 seconds. But if you haven't noticed, on my community tab, I did do a post asking you guys what kind of deck you guys wanted me to craft on my free-to-play account. You guys did kind of already suggest a couple decent decks from what I've seen, but I also want you guys to kind of vote on some decks. If you see any that you like that someone already suggested, if you haven't suggested one yourself, go ahead and do so, because my idea here is I really want to pick the one that you guys all seem to kind of want me to craft. Remind you that I am playing on an account that is free to play, very budget friendly. I don't really have too many wild cards to craft, so if you do suggest maybe a meta deck or a deck that has a lot of rares and mythics, I'm more than likely not going to be able to craft it immediately just because I won't have the currency. But with that being said, let's dive into the first deck and let's talk about it. All right, so this first deck up is something that's probably you may have seen before. If not, you may have not. And essentially what it is called, it's Azorious Magecraft, which essentially all it is playing along the side that Magecraft ability that came out of Strixhaven. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, certain things happen. In this particular creature, we get +2/+2 into end of turn. A lot of what our deck is doing is playing a lot of instants and sorceries that will are on the cheaper side that will help pump up our creatures. So Clever Luminancer is one of our creatures, and the other one is Leonine Lightscribe. Essentially, also benefiting, also giving all our creatures that we may have on the battlefield, not just itself, +1/+1 until end of turn, which is also very good. Combine that with something like Clarion Spirit, which is another good creature in the sense that whenever we cast our second spell each turn, we get to create a 1/1 flyer, which is definitely good. And if you have multiples of these out, you can start producing out some. You get very wide on the board and can definitely hit your opponent for a lot of damage. And now the rest of the deck to kind of help get us there is essentially, like I said, it's a lot of instances of sorcery. A lot of instances, I would say, not really any sorceries, besides maybe a few draw effects. So we have Defiant Strike, which besides it drawing us a card, being instant, gives our creature +1/+0, which is good. Fight as 1 for some protection, gives target human creature we control +1/+1 indestructible, non-human creature +1/+1 indestructible. So definitely a good card to, save it for maybe like a Heartless Act, eliminate, maybe even a board wipe is always good. Opt for a little bit of more draw. It's always good to kind of see the top card, whether you want to draw that one or not, or throw it on the bottom. Definitely get an instant speed and 1 mana. Stern Dismissal for a little bit of that bounce back if there's an annoying creature in your way that maybe your smaller creatures can't really attack through. Definitely good on that part. Then we got Symmetry Sage, another interesting card here. It's a 0/2 flyer with Magecraft, and whenever we cast our copy your instant sorcery spell, target creature we control has base power and base power of 2 until end turn. So you can either put it on this creature or maybe one of our other creatures. It just kind of gives our creatures that little bit of more oomph when it comes to just having a base overall power of 2, even if it's a 0. It definitely helps it out a little bit, gives that little bit of extra damage, which is always good. And it's a flyer, so it does have some of that evasion that may be able to get through for some damage, especially if opponent plays a lot of things on the ground. Clarion Spirit, yet again, it's our token producer, helps us overall produce a lot of tokens on the battlefield to overwhelm our opponent, get very wide on them, and then when we play one of our big creatures or go off with like a Leonine Lightscribe and give a lot of things +1/+1, it's definitely going to impact our opponent pretty good on that for the most part. Then we got Kabira Takedown. That's a 1 of in the deck. It's kind of like a deal damage equal to the number of creatures we control the target creature or planeswalker, which is definitely very good for that spot removal. Maybe there's like something like a Lovestruck Beast in your way that's a 5/5. Definitely hard for our creatures to attack through. Worst case scenario, you play it as a land into battlefield tap, which helps us out. We don't play a lot of lands in the deck because we're playing on the more cheaper side. We don't play many 3-drops. It's mostly 1 and 2 drops just because a lot of the things we're doing are just drawing cards. Like I said, Leonine Lightscribe is like the rare in the deck. I don't really think there's any other rares, I just realized, in the deck, but he's the one that's going to allow us to essentially, overwhelm our opponent with our wide board of small creatures because he's going to have all our creatures +1/+1. Seriously Shelter, yet again, another card that's going to come in the battlefield tapped as a land if we don't really need protection, or we can give target creature control protection of a particular color of our choice until end of turn. Remember, we do play white cards in our deck, so if we do play any spells that target white creatures and we already give our creatures protection from white, we can't technically target them. Just as a little bit of a heads up, but this is definitely a good way to prevent maybe someone, Bone Crusher Giant, one of your creatures, Heartless Act, Love Struck, or not Love Struck Beast. Any sort of removal is always good. Maybe even a bounce spell too. You can always give protection that way. Show of Confidence is like another unique card that helps in our deck because it's a card that whenever we cast or copy the spell, copy for each other instant or sorcery spell we cast this turn. So it essentially has like a storm ability, and then we choose new targets for the copies. So we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains vigilance to end of turn, so then we don't tap to attack, which makes it definitely very good because we can attack in aggressively, but then have some defense on the way back, which is a good thing. And, with our cheap spells, we can definitely maybe go off and maybe get 2 or 3 copies of this, which is definitely very good. And you can actually cast multiples of these as well. So if you cast one, you get 2 copies, and you cast another one to follow that up. You actually get those 2 additional copies plus any other spells you may have cast, so you then get like a bunch of those. Then we play Mentor's Guidance, yet again another card that helps us scry one and then draw a card, so kind of like an opt. But whenever we cast a spell, copy it if we control a Planeswalker, Cleric, Druid, Shaman, Warlock, or Wizard. I think most of our creatures in the deck are one of the above. We have a Wizard here. Light Scribe is also Cleric, and Clarion Spirit's just a Spirit, but, everything else in our deck does trigger this, so we can at least draw, 2 cards and scry, or 3 cards and scry if we do have a pretty full board. And on top of that, we do play of One Mind as another draw effect here. This costs 2 less to cast if we control a human creature and a non-human creature. And like I said, we have spirits and we have humans, so we definitely have that covered. And, it's definitely a good way to kind of just refill that hand back up at sorcery speed. Worst case scenario, we play for 3 mana. Best case scenario, we play for 1 blue, which is definitely very good. We played 10 planes, 7 islands, 4 pathways. You can play a tap dual land as well if you don't have the pathways, but pathways are always great, especially in an aggressive deck because you don't want lands to come into battlefield tapped. And then we have some other lands kind of on the modal sides of like the Seriously Shelter and Kabira Takedown. So we, in theory, do play 24 lands, I think the deck has, if you include those. So overall, pretty decent deck. Definitely a deck that can catch your opponent off guard just because it is very aggressive in what it's trying to do. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck. So another interesting deck that I did come across that I did find to be pretty cool. I did make a couple little tweaks to it just because I kind of wanted to maybe make it a little bit more on the budget side. I think this deck comes in with 8 rares, and it's essentially just a mono black pest or mono black token style deck. It does play a lot of pest, or pest being the current way really to kind of get a lot of tokens in the standard format as a whole. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to play a card called Dramatic Finale. It's a 4 mana enchantment that gives all our creature tokens +1/+1. And then whenever 1 or more non-token creatures we control would die, we get to create a 2/1 white black Inkling creature token with flying that trigger this ability only once each turn. So in its own, if our opponent does remove one of our creatures or removes our board, we kind of do have a way to replace it. Though we only do get 1 trigger. We don't trigger for each creature that may have died in this process. So if they do a board wipe, we have a few non-token creatures out, we only do get 1/2/1 in replacement, but it does come back on the battlefield as a 3/2, which is definitely very good and has flying. But it's definitely a very interesting style of deck when it has, you can also get multiple copies of this out on the battlefield, which is always very good. And like the Pest deck, if you haven't seen the Witherbloom Pest deck, it does play a lot of things that you may see similar to that deck. In the 1-drop slot, we are playing Bloodchief Sirs for that little bit of removal for creatures and or planeswalkers, and then we can kick it and we can remove pretty much any creature or planeswalker for the additional mana. I Twitch to go into our sideboard, which does have some lessons that we can definitely pull. Village Rites for that additional card draw. It's definitely a good way to have some sacrifice fodder just to get some card advantage out of it as well. Combine that with the rest of the cards in the deck, it definitely helps us out there. Heartless Act for that additional removal. Yet again, the one thing I do think that Witherbloom decks kind of lack is that bit of removal. So if your opponent's really going off on their side of the board, that's kind of how you get overwhelmed. So having both of these is definitely a good way to kind of slow your opponent down, especially if they're playing a very aggressive style deck on the opposite side. Hunt for Specimens, yet again another creature, another card in our deck that has Learn, goes into our sideboard to get a lesson, puts a 1/1 black-green pest token on the battlefield, which is definitely always good too, and just definitely helps us produce a board presence as a whole. Plumb the Forbidden, yet again another solid card that you've probably seen in the Pest deck if you haven't already, but essentially as additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures we control when you do copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way. So this is great to sacrifice your pest to. Maybe you want to sacrifice your eye twitch just to kind of go into your sideboard and get, you know, a lesson to maybe, you know, regroup some cards in your hand. But the idea here is you draw a card, lose a life every time you copy. Combine that with something like your Sedgemoor Witch, which reproduces the tokens. Combine that also with something like Dramatic Finale. If you like throw your eye twitch to a Plum of the Forbidden, you can then get the 2/1 in response as well, which is definitely always good. Always great to replace things that you may sacrifice as a whole. So definitely a good way to kind of, you know, help ramp your creatures or your tokens up on the battlefield. Of course, we're playing Bastion of Remembrance. Yet again, another benefit for us sacrificing things. Helps us ping our opponent for damage, as well as we gain a life every time, you know, a creature we control does die. So it does make it awkward, especially when your opponent starts getting low on life, to actually have to attack into us if we're just going to throw a chump blocker in the way. So definitely a good card to have to get kind of like pings our opponent down with us really having to do too much. With actually us killing our things actually, you know, hurts our opponent as well, which is definitely always good. I got Brackish Trudge in here. It's a card from Strixhaven. It's a 4/2 for 3 mana. It comes in a battlefield tap, which is the one downfall. But, you know, the one benefit here is we can tap 2, we can return it from our graveyard to our hand, and we can activate it only if we gain life this turn. So a lot of our things in our deck do gain life if they do die, like especially our pests. So this does have a pretty decent recurrence here. You can also play the card, I think it's from Zendikar Rise, and has the landfall ability. It's a 2 mana. Let me know down in the comments below. The only downfall with that one, it can't block, but it does come to the battlefield. Untap, it's the 3/1. The Nightshade, I think, is what it is. And, you know, that one, you know, triggers every time you play a land. So I think you can go either or. I didn't want to have in too many rares in the deck. That's kind of the one card I made the adjustment on. But I figure this is a pretty decent card as well. Sure, the tap, you know, effect is kind of crappy, but, you know, the idea here we can get it back for 2 mana and not have to rely on playing lands is definitely a decent, you know, benefit of it. It does maybe, I think, cost 1 more mana, but, you know, each their own. But the Nightshade is probably, you know, a better option just because it is cheaper on that end. It doesn't come to battlefield tap. It is also 3/1, so a little bit more aggressive, a little bit earlier. So it's up to you on what you may want to play here. But yet again, another creature we can always sacrifice and always get back if we gain life in the process. So it's definitely a good way to kind of reoccur it back into your hand just to kind of, you know, get this effect over and over again. Of course, we got Sedgemoor Witch. Helps us, you know, go off, kind of creating a pretty filled board of pests. Because whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, we get a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. Has ward, which makes our opponent have to pay 3 life in order to target it, or whatever they're targeting it with gets countered. And also has menace, so it definitely attacks him pretty decently, especially if your opponent's not playing a very wide board. We can definitely get in for some damage without making it harder for our opponent to block it as well. And like I said, we have the Dramatic Finale, which is the card that helps all our tokens just become that much stronger. We do have a decent amount of ways to produce additional pests, which then get +1/+1, which is definitely very good. So now we have 2/2 pests, which is also very good. We do play 24 lands in the deck. You know, the deck, yet again, really only 4 cards at 4-drop, and everything else is a 1, 2, or 3. So we have 21 swamps and 3 castle locked range just for that additional card draw. If we go into the sideboard, we have 3 copies of Necrotic Fumes, and then 3 copies of Pest Summoning. You know, some of these cards in here are, you know, if you want to make additional, you know, sideboard options. These are also cards you can always throw in the main deck if you want some, you know, hand hate from Agonized Remorse, additional Heartless Act, and if you want something that gives your opponent's creatures -1/-1 if they're also playing aggressive. You know, if your opponent's also playing Pest, this is definitely a good card. Worst case scenario, you always cycle it for 2 mana. So some cards to think about. The one problem is I would say there's not really any sort of board wipe effect that kind of, you know, helps eliminate your opponent's creatures without playing like something like Extinction Event, which is unfortunate. So that's definitely one of the downfalls that with where black is. So, you know, if you want to add some sort of massive board wipe, that's maybe a possibility. With that being said, I mean, this is definitely a fun deck. It definitely, you know, kind of like the Witherbloom deck, when it does start going off, it does go off pretty good. And like I said, in best of 1, you probably want the lessons just for the most part, because these will probably be more helpful than anything here. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So another interesting deck that I kind of came across as I was playing on, you know, the play queue, rank queue, whatever it is. Essentially what it is a snowy Gruul deck. It's kind of something similar to maybe what you've seen, but we are playing some snow lands. I did go a little bit more budget on the lands themselves, but you could always play, you know, the pathways. You could also play Fable Passage instead of the Evolve in Wilds when it comes to the mana base. So that is kind of, you know, where you can kind of maybe make some changes if you really, really want to. But essentially, this is kind of similar to most Gruul decks, but we are playing the Snow just for a couple things. We are playing it for the Frostbite, which is a pretty decent removal spell for target creature or planeswalker. 2 damage initially, but if we have 3 or more Snow permanents, it gets 3 damage. So, you know, all our lands besides the Evolving Wilds are Snow permanents, so that's the one benefit there. That's the one downfall if you do play Pathways, is that the Highland Forest then don't help you also produce more Snow permanents. So if you do play Pathways, then you have to get more basic lands as Snow permanents. So the one trade-off if you do decide to go that way. So definitely good there because it gets pumped up 3 with the Snow permanents. Hall Monitor is a very interesting card here. I do think this is going to be one of those cards you'll see in red decks going forward. In the way, just because it gives target creature can't block this turn. So especially if your opponent has something that's just like a stone wall, big wall in your way, like even their own Love Struck Beast or something like that, this can definitely get your creature through that without having to worry about, you know, trying to, you know, fight into it. So that's also very good. We play 2 copies of Blizzard Brawl. Definitely a good fight spell. Target creature control. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. They fight each other. If you control 3 or more Snow permanents, target creature control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible, and then those creatures fight. So essentially just a very good fight spell, especially with us playing Snowlands. Definitely a good way for us to also have other spot removal because our top end of the deck can be pretty decently large. So it definitely, we do have a couple cards that can definitely fight into some other creatures pretty decently. We are playing Adventures in the deck, so Edgewall Innkeeper makes the cut. Definitely a good draw engine in the early game, especially since a lot of our creatures we may have in the deck are adventure cards, so they do have the adventure side, so we'll get that additional benefit. We have Empress Shieldbreaker, just maybe in case our opponent's also playing artifacts. We do have the 1-mana sorcery to destroy target artifact. If not, we have a 2/1 on the other side, so definitely a good way of some spot artifact removal. Fire Prophecy for additional, you know, removal allows us to kind of take a card that we may have in our hand, put it on the bottom of our library, and then draw additional cards. So if we get something we may already have, like one of our legendary like permanents, like, you know, if we had like a second copy of the Great Henge or a second copy of Embercleave, but we don't want both, we can always just put one of them on the bottom and maybe draw something we do need, like that additional land or maybe that additional creature to, you know, help that go off. Rimrock Knight is definitely very good for the pump effect on the instant side for the Boulder Rush or the 2-mana 3/1. Great combination there to kind of, you know, make a creature much stronger, maybe play the fight spell on it, and then, you know, swing for some pretty big damage. Brushfire Elemental is like the card that kind of helps this deck kind of work, and especially in the early game and being very aggressive. It's a 2-mana 1/1 haster. So the first time it comes out, you know, it's going to be a 1/1, but it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so it makes it harder for your opponent to chump it. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, it gets +2/+2, so it definitely benefits from us playing, you know, either Evolving Wilds or Fabled Passages. So I would say you probably want to keep both in the deck, depending on which ones you want to play, just because it'll help this get much bigger. With that being said, in the early game, you can definitely get out of Great Henge pretty early. So if you do play like this on like turn 2, maybe turn 3, play a basic. Turn 4, if you have Fabled Passage, you play the Fabled Passage, play that, crack it, get a land. And then this is like a 5/5, then Great Henge costs 4, so definitely a good way to get that out on the cheap. We have Bone Crusher Giant yet again in the deck. It's a great removal spell, 2 mana, stomp something for 2 damage. And then, you know, it's a 3 mana 4/3 with an ability that if your opponent decides to target it, they take 2 damage in the process if they do decide to target, and it's a 4/3 for 3 mana, which is also very good. We have Kazul's Fury in the deck. It's yet again another card that maybe our opponent's getting very low. Maybe we have something like a Brushfire Elemental at a 5/5. Maybe they're at 5 or something like that. We can pay 3, sacrifice it, and deal that 5 damage to their opponent's face. Or worst case scenario, we always play it as a tap land if we need that additional red mana. Then we have Kanali Ambush. It's another fight spell at instant speed. Target creature we control fights target creature we don't control for 3 mana. Or we can play it as the land into battlefield tapped. Then we have Love Strike Beast, 2 copies, just to kind of keep it on the cheaper side. 1 mana, create a 1/1 human creature token. 3 mana, get a 5/5. Definitely the 5/5, even if we don't have the 1/1, is a decent wall that your opponent has to attack into. But we do have our fair share of 1/1s with the Edgewall Innkeepers, the Hall Monitors, the Brushfire Elemental if we don't have a land out. So definitely some decent other cards in the deck that definitely can, you know, make this be able to attack regardless of your opponent keeping or destroying the 1/1 in the battlefield. And of course, we have 1 copy of Elder Gargaroth. It's a very solid card. It's a 5 mana 6/6 with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. And whenever it attacks or blocks, we get to create a 3/3 green beast, gain 3 life, or draw a card. Definitely one of those are always very good depending on the situation, especially at this point. Our hand could be thin. You know, drawing that additional card could always, you know, make or break, you know, how our deck is going to do. And then to finish it off, we have 2 copies of Embercleave. Yet again, any Gruul deck or any deck that probably plays red that's aggro probably wants to play something like an Embercleave if you have the room, just because it gives target creature +1/+1 and double strike and trample. So essentially, this is like the card that's going to finish it off. If this is on something like a Love Struck Beast, that becomes a 6/6. You know, it's swinging in for technically 12 damage. Is definitely very big damage. So it's definitely a good card just to have in the deck as a whole. And then 1 copy of the Great Henge. Very solid card. Costs X less based on the greatest power amongst creatures we control. We tap it for 2 mana, we gain 2 life, and then whenever we play a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, we get a +1/+1 counter on it, and we draw a card. So just giving us that additional card draw if we do need it. And the mana base, like I said, is pretty straightforward. It's 9 mountains, 7 forests, 4 highland forests, and 4 evolve and wilds. They're all snow permanents, so I would say you have to play this as snow. So that is the one setback. So if your opponent is playing something that taxes our snow permanents, it's unfortunate. But I mean, overall, the deck is very fun. It is very aggressive. Maybe it's not as aggressive as maybe the current like Gruul deck that's, I think, kind of in the top, not in the top meta, but it's floating around somewhere in the meta. But it's definitely a very like a little bit more budget friendly, budget conscious, like aggro-ish mid-range deck, I would say. So definitely a fun deck to mess around with. Now, this last deck is a deck that I've been messing around with, and I did play against it, and when it went off, I was not prepared for what was about to happen, and this is a Mardu Reanimate deck, which is definitely a very interesting deck on what it's trying to do. So, essentially, what the deck is trying to do is, we're playing a spell in the deck called Return Upon the Tide, which is a spell that reanimates a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield if it was an elf, create 2 elf warrior creature tokens. That's not really the important part. The idea here is we're trying to return target creature card to the battlefield, essentially paying cheaper mana than actually paying its converted mana cost. So what we're trying to do is get something back like that's really big, like our Velomachus, Lorehold, and or our Massacre Worm. One of these 2 cards are like the cards we want to hit, just essentially because Velomachus, for example, if we actually, resurrected it from the graveyard with the Return Upon the Tide, this goes into the graveyard. We can then essentially play Velomachus, attack in for some damage, possibly look at the top 7 cards in our library, and possibly reveal another Return Upon the Tide to return something like a Massacre Worm that if that also got milled into our graveyard, which definitely creates a very interesting effect overall. So it's just like a good, interesting way. If you do probably both of that, your opponent's probably just going to be like, well, I give up at this point. This deck is probably a little bit more on the expensive side just because there is a few more rares in it and mythics, but it is a fun deck to mess around with. I would say it's like, it's like a fun deck, I would say, that can go off and catches your opponent by surprise. But we're playing a little mixture of a little bit of everything, trying to stall out until we can get to a point where we can return something back from the graveyard to the battlefield. So we do play things like Heartless Act for that spot removal. We play Mire Triton to help us mill our cards into our graveyard. We gain 2 life in the process, so definitely, and it has Death Touch, so definitely a good chump blocker to stop your opponent from swinging with something big on the ground. We have Null Piece of Oblivion, which is another card that I kind of found. I don't know if this is something that this style of deck plays. I know people have been talking about it. I did see someone post about making this style of deck on my budget account. But essentially, what this card does, it's a 2/1 for 2 mana with Menace and Lifelink. But we can also pay 4 mana on top of the 2 mana and kick it. And it enters the battlefield, and if it was kicked, we get to return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. So we return something like a Velomachus and or a Massacre Worm. Worst case scenario, if we haven't drawn somehow Return Upon the Tide, or these have gotten built into the graveyard. We also have Valki, God of Lies, and this is another interesting card here. In the early game, we can always play it as the Valki side. In the late game, if we draw it, we can always play it as the Tybalt side. Both the Tybalt side is probably like the side we want to play it on, just because of Tybalt being pretty good overall as a Planeswalker. If you haven't played against Tybalt, he is one of the most annoying Planeswalkers because you start stealing your opponent's things, and you can actually play those cards that your opponent that you've stolen from your opponent. You can exile a target artifact or creature, and if you get to -8, you can exile all cards from all graveyards and add 3 mana. So essentially, all the cards in any graveyard are now yours to cast. So he definitely is an interesting card. And then his front side is actually, you steal a creature card from your opponent's hand, exile the creature card until he leaves the battlefield, then we can tap X and choose that creature card, exile with Valki with a mana cost value of X, and Valki becomes a copy of that creature card. So essentially, Valki becomes whatever creature you've stolen if you had the open mana to then tap it. So against a lot of the aggressive decks, if your opponent doesn't kill it after you play it, and maybe you did steal like your opponent's 3-drop, you then make Valki a copy of that 3-drop. None of the ETB effects actually trigger, so if you decide to, trigger a card that when it enters the battlefield does something, Valky's effect is not going to do that. But, essentially you could steal like maybe something like your opponent's Bone Crusher Giant, or maybe steal some card that you think they're going to play on like turn 3 or something to slow them down, and then having your Valky become that creature is kind of like a slap in the face against your opponent, just because you're hitting your opponent with their own card essentially at that point. We also play some cards that helps us draw and discard cards. So if we do want to throw these cards in our graveyard to get them set up for a return upon the tide, so we play 2 copies of Throw a Possibility, 4 copies of Throw on Discovery. Both cards we essentially discard a card, draw 2 cards. Well, Throw on Discovery, we draw 3 cards. But Throw a Possibility, we can do at instant speed, discard a card to draw 2 cards, which is definitely very good. Seize the Spoils, which helps us ramp up a little bit of mana. By discarding a card, creates a treasure token, we draw 2 cards. Draconic Intervention is kind of like our board wipe, because we're discarding things into the graveyard. If we threw something like a Devastating Mastery into the graveyard, play a Draconic Intervention on turn like 4 or 5, we exile this does 7 across the board, and exiles them. So that's definitely very good. Return Upon the Tide's our spell to kind of also get our creatures back from the graveyard to the battlefield. Devastating Mastery, if we do get to this point, we can spend the 4 mana, or the 6 mana, which is 4 white, which is definitely kind of tough for us to play, but it is possible because we do have the mana base to kind of, filter our mana in the proper way to kind of get that 4 additional mana. But essentially, it's destroy all non-land permanents, so if your opponent's playing other things besides creatures, this will destroy all those things. Worst case scenario, we can always pay 4 mana, and they get to choose 2 permanents, and then the rest of their they control and returns them to their hands. So essentially, they can bounce 2 things back to their hand if we want to pay on the cheaper end. But it has 2 effects, which is definitely very good. You'd rather destroy everything instead of bouncing things back, but it is what it is depending on the situation. Like I said, Massacre Worm is a very strong card in this deck, especially with the format being a lot of aggro. Essentially enters the battlefield. Creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 in a turn, and then whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. So if they're playing a lot of like tokens, with something like Witherbloom and Pest being popular, this will definitely take out a lot of them, a lot of the weaker creatures in general. And then your opponent's going to start pinging damage, and even though they may gain life out of it, they're still going to probably ping more damage than what they would gain back. And of course, Velomachus, Lorehold. It's a 7 mana, 5/5, flying haster. Whenever he attacks, look at top 7 cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery with mana card less than value equal to him, and from among them without paying their mana cost, for the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Like I said, you play this either from this or in some formal way. Get him on the battlefield, get another one of these, play something like a Massacre Worm. It can kind of go off in a way, but definitely a fun little combo to do. You can also get rid of maybe your opponent's board in the process if you play this. Top one of these off the top of your library. Get rid of something like Seize the Spoils. Do 3 damage across the board to everything that your opponent has, exile their things, and then the board open to yourself. Definitely very interesting there. Then we got 3 copies of Plains, 7 Swamps, 4 Mountains, 4 copies of the Needle Verge Pathway, and we have 4 copies of the Savoy Triumph, just because it's the Mardu style land. It comes in battlefield tapped, but it's going to help us produce the mana that we do need. And then we do also have 4 copies of Fabled Passage. Yet again, a very fun deck. It's a very mechanic heavy deck. If your opponent has some graveyard hate, it's definitely going to cause some problems. But if you do get lucky and do get to go off of it, it's definitely a fun deck that definitely can create havoc for your opponent very, very quickly if you're not prepared for it. But with that being said, guys, if you like the video, let me know down in the comments below maybe which one of these decks are your favorite out of all of them. If you've played any of them, if you played against any of them that kind of surprised you. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next video.